channel. If you're new here, hi, my name is Lillian and I like to talk about books, and if you end up enjoying this video, feel free to subscribe so we can talk about books together. So today's video is going to be for a book that I read recently that quite honestly blew me away, and I wanted to do an entire dedicated review for it so I have the time and the space to really delve into and talk about it and share my thoughts with you. Again, my apologies for the not great lighting. I don't usually like to use the overhead, but filming in winter proves challenging sometimes, so we make do. And also, if you hear any rustling around in the background, I have at the moment a very adorable kitty curled up in some leftover Christmas wrapping, and she's very content there and I don't want to disturb her. So if that's something you hear in the background, that's what that is. So the book that I really wanted to talk to you today about is Paul Takes the Form of a Mortal Girl by Andrea Lawlor. This came out in 2017. Summary-wise, this is set in 1993 and follows our protagonist Paul Polydoros, who is a bartender at the only gay club in his university town in Iowa City, where he studies queer theory, makes signs, frequents his local punk music scene, is a general flaneur, and has a rich and varied dating and sex life. Paul, however, has a secret. He is a shapeshifter and goes from riot girl to leather cub to women's studies major to pretty much anything in between. Paul's transformations and escapades take him from Iowa City to the woods of Michigan to Provincetown and eventually lands him in San Francisco. It's a journey through the deep queer archives of culture, struggle, and pleasure. I'll say this up front, there is a lot of sex that happens in this book, and if that's something that you know really isn't your cup of tea, don't really enjoy reading about, you may want to steer clear of this one. I'm going to touch on the use of the sex scenes in this book a little bit later in this review. Overall, this is a very sex-positive book, and to me it felt like there was definitely a purpose and a reason that these scenes existed and was supporting one of the larger themes of this book. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, I was really blown away by this book. It swept me off my feet. I did the classic, I'm just going to read the first couple lines of this book just to see what it's like, maybe determine how quickly I want to read it, and then I didn't look up for another 50 pages. Overall, this story felt like a very intimate and tender love letter to the queer culture of the 90s and the generations that came before it. When talking about this novel, non-binary author Andrea Lawlor says, quote, "Sometimes I describe the novel as thinly veiled autobiographical fiction, but of course I'm not literally a shapeshifter. I definitely found the writing of this book to be very engaging. The narration and Paul's inner monologue in this book I found to be really engrossing, really entertaining, and quite often very funny. There are a number of themes and undertones in this book that in many ways feel like a practical application of, or the observation of, queer theory in practice. There are a few scenes, mainly at the beginning of this book in the college setting, where Paul will be having conversations with other people and he'll throw out little bits of queer theory, which makes sense in context because that's one of the things that he's studying at college, and it gets thrown into the mix of discussions of popular culture, music, media. But by no means do I think you have to have an understanding of queer theory in order to enjoy this book or even those scenes. With his shape-shifting nature, Paul goes by either Paul or Polly depending on his presentation that day or night or hour. I will note that Lawlor doesn't use the pronouns they in order to describe Paul, and neither does he use them to describe himself. My guess is that this wasn't something that was as well known or talked about in the 90s as it is today. Collective understandings of gender and presentation are constantly changing. So the person that is both Paul and Polly is always referred to as he throughout this story. A large aspect or theme of this book is Paul dealing with a lot of external societal pressure and pressure from even within the queer community to conform, to quote-unquote pick a side of man or woman, to neatly categorize himself into one box or another. And Paul struggling with that, as well as his own struggle with himself of trying to figure out who he is, what he is. There is a love story that happens in this book where Paul falls for a lesbian named Diane while presenting as Polly. They begin a relationship, but once Diane becomes aware that Paul embodies both aspects of male and female, she becomes very uncomfortable. The story is soaked in references to 90s pop and underground cultures. It radiates the joy of being young and queer, but also depicts how discrimination and the ravages of the AIDS epidemic has threatened the queer community. Lawlor also weaves in aspects of mythology that helps create a really nice balance and prevents this from being too much of a period piece, I think. Polydorus is a common name in Greek mythology, and the adventures of Paul Polydorus, the queer shapeshifter, have a very allegorical quality to them. I was really enthralled by Paul as a character. He feels so alive on the page. His roving desires, his boundless curiosity about other people and what it is that they desire, what they want. In his journey to understand who and what he is, Paul describes himself as something akin to Virginia Woolf's Orlando, a gender-bending character that moves their way across English bourgeois society throughout history, but does so in a very heterosexual manner. Paul Polydorus, on the other hand, queers the queer 90s, subtly troubling and disrupting the various queer cultures and subcultures that he gains entry to. Paul is never stably a man or a woman. He is neither and both at the same time. Paul himself observes that, quote, he belongs in all of the genders. His gender identity is thus expansive and really defies any clean or clear categorization, which I think a modern audience might read as something along the lines of genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, but at its heart, at its core, it's inherently queer. Is Paul gay? Is Paul bi? Is Paul a lesbian? Is Paul transmasculine, transfeminine, non-binary, intersex? Paul is all. At the end of the day, he is fluid fantasy. He is queer desire embodied. The sex and intimacy scenes in this book, of which there are many, stand as an exploration of the varied nature of queer desire and queer love. It is unapologetically erotic and sex positive, which I think is something that has been toned down in a lot of queer media in the past several decades, likely as a means to kind of appease and make things more marketable for a larger audience. But this book and its characters really aren't afraid to go there and explore any number of intimacies, desires. Paul obtains many partners in his quest to understand himself, to understand others, and to be open and unapologetic about pleasure. Something that I think this book embodies and does really well, and I love it for that, is the component of queer sexuality that really rejects any kind of shame around sex and pleasure that is so prevalent in heterosexual and patriarchal mindsets and standards in modern society. As a reader, I think you could see this book as being a historically set novel, but in many ways this story feels like it's history made present tense. Lawlor has reached back into the world of 90s queer culture and dragged it into the present day to examine through a lens of contemporary queer and trans discourse. Even as Paul's body refuses to be categorized, his identity, his presentation is constantly changing and fluid. The character himself stays the same. He is constantly witty, but mostly gay, a shark, a hunter, a pleasure seeker, an outsider seeking contact and understanding from others and from himself, an artist collecting memories and experiences. Like I said in the beginning, this book utterly swept me off my feet. I was blown away. I don't think I've ever read anything quite like it. It definitely had an almost surreal kind of queer fever dream mentality about it that I adored. This book was an easy 5 out of 5 stars for me and is definitely on my list of favorite books that I've read this year. Have you read this book? If so, what are your thoughts? Please leave a comment below. I would love to discuss this book with other people. If there's any other queer literature that you've read in your life and have really been blown away by, please let me know in the comments as well. I definitely want to read more queer literature in the coming year. But with that, I think I'm going to wrap this review up. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, you can subscribe, see more from me. I hope that you all are staying safe and healthy during this season, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye.